Hey everybody. So this is chapter 14, Two Societies at War. This is the American Civil War. 1861-1865. This chapter will cover the war. Um, that's pretty much it. We'll actually go all the way through. Yeah, that's all we'll cover in this chapter is the war. The worst conflict in American history, more casualties in the American Civil War than in all other wars combined since the Revolution. Um, And what may even be the worst part of it is just it was Americans killing Americans. This is Timothy L. Sullivan's photograph of Antietam, which I believe was the deadliest battle of the war. Antietam. Um, Pictures speak 1,000 words. There's a lot of things in this. Certainly good for discussion. American Civil War was the first large-scale war, the first war, major war that was photographed in its entirety. Photography was a brand new technology. There are thousands of photographs during the American Civil War. Be thankful they're black and white. Because as you can see here in this image, you have at least 5 or 6 dead bodies right here. Dead soldiers. Some of them missing clothing, probably because other people or soldiers came along afterwards and scavenged the bodies for valuables, simply clothes. In the background, you can see a farmhouse. You see it's got big holes in the walls, probably from cannons. This war was fought on the fields, the farmlands all across the South. Um, Timothy L. Sullivan photographed this. And so the question becomes, why? Sometimes we say art is for art's sake. This is not for art's sake. Timothy L. Sullivan had a purpose. Why did he choose to take all these photographs of the battlefields? He then took the photos and then took them back to the north, and we're showing people these photos. We're publishing these photos. What was his purpose? What was his message? During the middle of this war, Antietam was right in the middle. Antietam was 62, 63. It was sort of in the middle of the war. What's his purpose in this? What does this say about Americans? What does this say about the war itself? That we were able to slaughter each other. This isn't enemies, this isn't foreigners, these are other American citizens literally murdering each other. It's war, so technically murder is the wrong word, but still, it's brother killing brother, neighbor killing neighbor. Um, Many times these wars were fought just right across state lines. Were literally people that used to shop in the same town, go to the same markets, kids that might even gone to the same school, now are killing each other over the issue. We often say the wars over the issue of slavery. Slavery is it's not directly slavery. The war is directly over state versus federal rights. Although it needs to be clear, the right that they're most concerned about is slavery. That's the right that is the focus of it. So, what about all the farm families? Again, this is a war. This right here battle was fought in farmland. What about the farm family that used to live in that house? The house is now full of 2 foot wide holes from cannonballs. You'd have to hope the family was already gone. They weren't in the house anymore, and that's also possible. The family could have even still been left in the house. And afterwards, where do you go from here? The farmland's been destroyed. The forests and the crops have been burned. The houses are destroyed. The men, the sons, the boys, the fathers are dead. Where do you go? How do you start over? It took America decades to recover from this. Imagine if this was your farm. I mean, just think about the meanings, all the meanings of this. What did Timothy want to really convey to people back home who weren't on the battlefields? by showing these images. Secession and military stalemate, 61 to 62. In Southern society, a slave society had existed for 2 centuries now. It defined the South. It was the South. The election of Abraham Lincoln in the fall of 1860, with most Republicans at this time dedicated to ending slavery. Pretty much the South is prepared to secede, to go to bloody war to protect its slave system. This leads to this massive war, which results in more deaths than any other conflicts, all other conflicts combined. 650,000 dead, hundreds of thousands more injured. And that doesn't even include the long lasting repercussions of the violence, the starvation, the death, the disease, the fact that it took years and years for crop production to recover. Yeah. South Carolina was first, the same way back during the Jackson nullification crisis. We see the Carolinas going first. South Carolina secedes in December, right after Lincoln is elected. They feared his presidency would end slavery, even though Lincoln was not committed to ending slavery at all. The Republicans in general were. The Republican Party in general was very anti-slave. So simply assume that the Republicans / Lincoln would end slavery. The Fire Eaters, these are the Southern Democrats, which really called for war. The Fire Eaters they called for conventions. They expected all the other Southern states to join, to have these pro-slave conventions that would declare their independence from the United States. And by February of 61, most of them do. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, all of them secede from the Union by January, February. Bear in mind, all this is happening when Lincoln can do nothing. He's not president. He was elected in November, but he's president-elect. He doesn't actually take office until March. So for the better part of 4 months, he just has to sit there and twiddle his thumbs. Nothing he can do. He's not president right now. He can take no action. The congressmen of the southern states, they met, they declared themselves the Confederate States of America, a brand new country, and they elect a new president, Jefferson Davis. They elect a new Congress. They create their own entire government of this Confederate States, the South, the Confederacy, the Rebels, or the CSA. I generally refer to them as the CSA or the South. Now, the border states were a little more hesitant. And the reason the border states were hesitant should be obvious. The states that border the North, of course, if war begins, they're going to be the first states attacked. Because when the North marches into the South, they're going to have to go right through the border states. So the border states are a little more unsure whether they should join the South or not. Because if they join the South, they know they're going to be the first ones attacked. So some southern states do join and some don't. It's a little tricky situation. Every state has its own decisions. The border states simply don't know what to do. Now, the president is Buchanan at the time, and President Buchanan does nothing. He basically declares the southern states have the right to do whatever they want. He chooses to err on the side of states' rights, that the states, if they want, can secede from the Union and leave. They do not have to stay. Well, many people would disagree with that. Nonetheless, Buchanan makes that decision to not enforce the Union and to allow the southern states to secede and leave. He makes no real action, and he says the government really has no right to stop them from doing this. If the states don't want to be part of the U.S., they simply don't have to be. It's their right to do it. Yeah. He also takes no action to protect Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is where the actual first shots of the war are fired. Fort Sumter is in Carolina. It is a federal military fort. Therefore, when Fort Sumter was attacked by the Carolina militia, Buchanan should have taken action. Even if He said the southern states could secede. The fort was actually military property. It was federal property. Therefore, it was an attack on the United States or attack on the federal government. And Buchanan said, no, it's in the southern states. I'm just not going to worry about it. It's there, so I'm not going to get into a conflict with them over this. So he did not do anything about Fort Sumter, which was attacked and overrun by the Confederacy, which is really where the war really begins. Now, Buchanan does actually ask Congress to make a decision. He says Congress has to act. In other words, laws have to be passed. I'm not going to take military action. I'm not going to use my power of law enforcement, which is really what the executive branch is. The executive branch is really the enforcement power of the United States government. And the president decides not to enforce the laws. And he says it's on Congress to make a decision. Congress must come up with a new compromise. The way they came up with a compromise in 1820, a compromise in 1840, a compromise in 1850. There must be a compromise of 1860 or 61. Therefore, Congress has to fix this. They do put together a compromise. It is known as the Crittenden Compromise. It is a plan to try and stop all this from happening. However, very few people will vote for it. The Southerners have left. Literally, the Southern Congress people have left Washington. They've gone to the South. They're not even there to vote on it, a lot of them. Some are. There are still some Northern Democrats who are moderate and think the war is wrong. They might be pro-slave, but they don't believe war is the answer. So you do have some Democrats left in Washington, but the vote fails. There's no compromise made. There is no way to stop what has happened. The fourth time is not the charm. Lincoln becomes president. In his inaugural address, he declares the United States a perpetual union. That's the word cut off there if you can't see it. A perpetual union. In other words, the southern states do not have the ability to secede or the right to secede. The U.S. is forevermore. It cannot be torn apart by this secession crisis. And he also declares unequivocally he will use any force necessary to ensure the perpetual union. That's the words the Southerners were expecting. Many Southerners were expecting. I mean, you know what the Southerners called this war, right? People in the South called this officially the War of Northern Aggression. The Southerners blamed the North for this war. Of course, the North said the South caused the war by trying to break apart the U.S. and secede. So, very different perspectives on this. He does give them a threat. He gives them a sort of a threat. It says, you must come back. All these southern states must rejoin or else it will be war. Not a single state came back. This is Southerners, Southern congressmen, Southern politicians, or just Southern men in general. Look how they're dressed, and their top hats, and their coats, and their fancy attire, and they are celebrating the war, or not the war specifically. I take that back. They're celebrating secession. They're celebrating the fact that they have finally achieved independence for their slave society. Now, they didn't see it that way necessarily. There, for them, it was about independence and freedom and equality and fair treatment to live the lives they want, enslaving and brutalizing and terrorizing and oppressing and murdering and raping and torturing 4 million black men and women. Of course, they didn't see it that way. The Southerners were very excited about this. Most Southern people were very much for this. We know from writings and public opinion and diaries and stories, most Southerners were on board with this. But it needs to be made clear, no one understood the scale of what was about to happen. No one understood the catastrophe that was about to descend upon the United States. No one understood it. South Carolina takes Fort Sumter. This is in South Carolina. This is the very first cannons fired. The Union soldiers, that's what we're going to call the North. The North is the Union. In other words, the United States is a perpetual union. That is the northern states, Lincoln as president. The Union tries to hold the fort. The Union troops, they fire cannons. They're eventually overrun and taken prisoner. And the war is started, and Fort Sumter is captured, and the Confederacy has won the first battle with the first shots fired. People joined the war effort pretty quickly, actually. Many people volunteered. Um, Lincoln asked for 75,000 militia. He doesn't even ask for official military. What he actually asks is for the states to gather together soldiers and to make state militias, like Ohio militia, New York militia, and then to actually sort of contract them to the United States. So he wasn't even using federal power to build up military troops. He was actually borrowing troops from the states and putting them under military authority, under federal authority. And he asked for 75,000. He thinks that should be enough to deal with it. This is way more soldiers than the U.S. had at the time. Yeah, he expected the rebellion to end in 90 days. He planned on this being done in 3 months. People were gung ho about this. Lots of patriotism. Lots of people believed the South was wrong in what they were doing. Like Ohio, for instance. Ohio was asked for 13 regiments of soldiers. Just in the first 6 months, they gave up 20 regiments, 50% more than they were asked for. So people were excited by this. People were looking for adventure. They were also believing that we were the just cause. This was a just conflict. The Southerners were wrong to go to war and try to break apart the entire United States over the issue of slaves. Yeah. Yeah. Enthusiasm for the war was rampant in the North and in the South. Early on in the war, the entire military for almost first 2 years was volunteer, both North and the South. For a better part of the first 2 years, there were tens of, eventually hundreds of thousands of volunteers. Um, that changes halfway through the war. Yeah. Northern Republican support, of course, and Northern Democrat support. For instance, Stephen Douglas, the one who had been an enemy of Lincoln in multiple ways, who'd competed against Lincoln, debated against Lincoln, he'd beat Lincoln in elections. Stephen Douglas actually supported Lincoln in this, believing that even though slavery, he was pro-slave, even he had his own slaves. I think he had like a slave mistress that he had kids with. So he believed in slavery, but he didn't believe in war. He didn't believe in fighting. He believed that this was the wrong way to go. There had to be a compromise to be made. So he even supported Lincoln in this initially. So we get quite a bit of Northern Democrat support for this as well. Many people simply believe this war could destroy America. They were right. They were right. It really came close. Now the 8 border states are really tricky. There were 8 border states. So you have what about what about 8 states that join initially, 7 or 8 states that join right off the bat? Then you've got 8 border states. And the border states, as I said, they're the first ones that are going to be attacked. So they're a little unsure about what to do. Do we join the South? Because if we join the Confederacy, the first Northern armies are going to roll right through our front yard. So what are we going to do? Yeah. This is interesting about the border states, though. The majority of all Southern whites, the majority of all Southern food, and the majority of all Southern industry was in the border states. Incredibly significant. Incredibly significant. You might say, well, the entire South was agriculture. Yeah, you can't eat cotton. Most of the agriculture that was grown in the South was not consumable for food. So the entire South was agriculture, but it was all cotton, useless to eat or feed your family on. So most of the actual edible growth, edible agriculture was in the border states. So it was incredibly important which direction these states went. It really was. Well, ultimately, we get an even split. 4 go south and 4 go north. 4 join the CSA and 4 join the Union. So Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, they join the CSA. Is that Delaware? Should be Delaware, right? Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland join the Union. It's interesting. Now, the 4 border states that join the CSA are pretty direct. These are pretty big states. They pretty quickly choose to go south, to go with the South. There's quite a lot of slaves in these states. Now, the other ones are interesting. Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky voluntarily join with some negotiation. The negotiations are pretty much can be boiled down to this. They got to keep their slaves. So yes, several states join the Union. under the agreement that they got to keep their slaves. So slavery didn't end in Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. They got to be part of the Union. They actually gave up Union soldiers, and they were continued to be slave states. Now, Maryland did not choose to join. Maryland actually tried to go join the CSA, but the thing is, if you're unaware, Maryland surrounds Washington on three sides. So Washington, I guess I should say it differently. The government, Lincoln, immediately attacks Maryland. That's actually the first attack of the North, and they conquer Maryland right off the bat because Maryland surrounds the capital. So they had to actually take Maryland to ensure the safety of Washington, D.C. And then Virginia joins the South. Well, halfway through the war, Western Virginia actually secedes from Virginia and says they don't want any part of being part of slave society. There were almost no slaves in West Virginia. It was almost entirely a white rural population, miners, like coal miners or whatnot. And they want no part of the war. And they actually believe their economy, because the only way you make money as a coal miner is if people buy your coal. So they believed their economy would be much beneficial to be part of the Union. Plus, they didn't have slaves anyway, generally. So halfway through the war, West Virginia actually secedes from Virginia, and Virginia gets cut in half, and West Virginia is admitted to the Union as a brand new state. And of course, it's a state today. So that's how that ends up happening. And that's how the split ends up going. So you get 4 north, 4 south, and technically you end up with 5 north with a brand new state. And here you can see it here. You can see where people who are for secession is the green area. And you end up with, I think, how many is it, 12 states? Oh, looks like 11. Oh, goodness, I thought it was 12. Okay, 11 states, 12 states you get. Missouri goes north. I mean, Missouri didn't have a choice, right? Missouri is surrounded by free territory. Missouri on 3 sides is surrounded by free territory. If Missouri had chosen to go south as part of the Confederacy, they would have been conquered quickly. Kentucky, the same thing. Kentucky is also surrounded by 3 free states: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Kentucky would have been conquered quickly, so they chose to go north. They just decided it was smart to do that. Maryland is taken by force. Delaware is surrounded by Pennsylvania, New Jersey, right here, New York. Delaware chooses to go north. And then West Virginia, right here, halfway through the war, actually secedes and joins the North. And then all these states become the slave states, the slave confederacy. And I really think it's interesting where the capital is. The capital of the Confederacy is Richmond, Virginia, which is like right here somewhere. And then, of course, Washington's like right here. The capital of the two countries now, the CSA and the Union, are like 100 miles apart. In the first 2 years of the war, the major strategy of both sides is to take the other capital. And they both fail. All right, well, the objectives and the strategies of the war are complicated. This is huge. I mean, you realize the U.S. is like the size of Europe. So this is a huge territory we're talking about here. Thousands of miles across in 2 different directions, to millions of square miles. It's huge. So lots of strategies and tactics are employed during this war, and it's constantly changing and evolving. Now, Jefferson Davis generally said everything they were doing was in revolutionary terms. Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy, they sort of fashioned themselves as revolutionary war heroes, that they were revolting against a corrupt and oppressive government that would, oh my God, take away slavery from them. It's almost mind-boggling, isn't it? Could the Southerners not see this? Do the Southerners not see that everything they're arguing against, oppressive, intrusive, destructive society, is exactly what they were perpetuating? I think a lot of them simply didn't see it. It had been so long, it's so ingrained into their psyche and their psychology that they just didn't even realize what they were defending was brutal and barbaric and cruel in every way, and yet they were willing to fight and die for it. Now, what's interesting about the war here is the North had to win this war. The South didn't. The South had already won. They seceded. So this is a really odd conflict. If the North had ever stopped fighting, the war would have simply ended. It would have simply been done. So the North had to win. The South, They didn't have to win. All they had to do was not lose. Different thing. The South simply had to hold out, simply had to defend itself until the North gave up. But the North had to actively win this conflict. So the odds were, well, in essence, if you want to look at mathematically, it was 3 times harder for the North. Everything they did, they had to have 3 times more men, 3 times more aggression. Because all the South literally had to do was build up some defenses, put up some walls, and sit back and drink their mint juleps and just wait. I'm obviously simplifying it, but the point being, the North had to do all the work. The North had a much higher hill to climb than the South, which pretty much had just to sit back and protect itself. So 1861, Lincoln wants aggression. He wants aggressive attacks. The main general of Lincoln's armies, remember there's lots of generals, but the head general is General McClellan. He's the one who's really in charge of the Union armies. Now he wants decisive action. He wants Richmond taken. He wants Richmond captured, believing to capture Richmond, which is where the capital is, it's where Jefferson Davis is, it's where the Confederate government is, will simply cut the head off the snake and end the battle and end the whole conflict. He thought. Will it have happened or not, we don't know, because it doesn't happen, so we don't really know. We often call this the Battle of Bull Run. This leads to panic. This leads to brutality. Hundreds of people die, murdering and killing each other on the battlefield. It's brutal. Now, let me give you an idea how it was. People actually came out with their picnics. They came out with their picnics and their tents and their carriages, dressed in their Sunday finest. They came out with their servants and slaves. This was in the South. This was in Virginia. It was actually like a social event. Imagine people coming out for a sporting event. That's what it was. They didn't understand what was about to happen. Suddenly there's bullets flying all over the place. There's cannons going off. Civilians, women in their fine clothes are getting blown to pieces. It was a freaking disaster. And people realized immediately this was not going to be some sort of gentlemanly conflict where people do a few shooting at like almost like a duel to where 2 men shake hands and they walk and they both fire one shot and maybe one lives, maybe one gets a shoulder wound and you shake hands or you slap each other in the face with some gloves and there some people had an idea that it was going to be like this. They didn't expect 5,000 screaming men on a battlefield literally chopping each other to pieces and blowing each other's heads off. No one really understood what this was going to be. It becomes quite clear early that this is going to be far more brutal than anyone actually was anticipating. Immediately, the Union under Lincoln asked for a 1,000,000-man recruitment. Almost immediately after this battle, Lincoln is told by his generals, this is going to be way different than we thought. We need a lot more people. And Lincoln asked Congress for 1,000,000 men for a real army. Up to 3 years. So we literally go 1 month from 75,000 troops for 3 months to now 1,000,000 troops for 3 years. His generals inform him this is going to be much worse than he thought. Now McClellan was the leader. McClellan launches major attacks. In 62, McClellan launches another attack. 61, 62. McClellan has several attacks. Technically, he loses several of these fights because McClellan retreats. He actually mathematically won them. He had more soldiers at the end than the other side, but McClellan often backs up because he believes it's too brutal. He doesn't want so many people being murdered and killed and destroyed on the battlefield, so he retreats multiple times when he actually had the advantage. Through the entire war, the Union had more soldiers and more supplies, and yet the Union loses many battles because they choose to not be as aggressive as the Southerners. He moves slowly. He allows the Confederates to get reinforcements, and Richmond is not conquered. Richmond is never conquered until the end. All right, now the Confederate general, though, is much more aggressive. The Confederate general, they got a winner with this. Now, Lee had actually been a Union Army officer. But when the war began, he left the Union and joined the South, which is one of the worst things that could have ever happened. because General Lee, hopefully I said Lee, I don't know what I said, but Lee, who's on the screen there, Lee is probably the most capable general in the military in this time. Lee's excellent. He is a modern version of General Washington. He really is. He's a brilliant strategist. He knows tactics. He knows war. He knows how to organize men and supplies and training. If only he'd been on our side, this war probably would have ended in the first year. Instead, we had McClellan. Um, Robert E. Lee was a tactical genius. Unfortunately, he was working for the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee also decides to go on the offensive. With the defeat attempt of taking Richmond at Bull Run, Lee gets the idea to do the same exact thing to the Union, to capture Washington. So Lee gets his army together and he goes up after Washington to capture Washington, D.C., thereby, again, cutting the head off the Union snake to possibly end the war early. He wins at the second Battle of Bull Run, 62, which is another attack on Richmond. He wins again. And then he goes ahead and launches an attack on Washington and heads towards Washington. The next major battle is at Antietam Creek, 62. So this is about a year and a half into the battle, into the war. About a year and a half into the war. September 17th, 1862, I think I said this at the beginning. That was that first picture we saw. The deadliest battle, the deadliest day, I think, of the entire war was September 17th, 1862. Horrible casualties. On this one day alone, we had almost 30,000 casualties, American soldiers, between the North and the South. Almost 30,000 casualties in one battle. Oh, I take that back. That's one day. The bloodiest day in American military history. 30,000 casualties in one day. Now that's not dead. Casualties are dead or injured. So, but still, 30,000 dead or injured in one single day. We've never had anything ever happen like that before or since. Now, Lee retreated from this battle. Interestingly enough, he retreated for the same reason McClellan kept retreating. Lee saw so much death and so much brutality and so many butchered bodies, he simply took his army and left, believing it wasn't worth it trying to capture Washington. Not to mention, he might have lost his entire army. So, I mean, there was also probably a practical reason for it. But part of the reason was he simply said it was too much. It was simply too much. Thing is, we're going to find out over the next 3 years of this war, this is just the beginning. The too much actually only gets worse and escalates. It only gets more and more and more brutal as the war goes on. Lincoln claims victory for this, and he does. I mean, Washington, D.C. doesn't fall, so I guess technically it's a Union victory, and Lee does leave the battlefield and retreat. But McClellan is just unwilling to take the action he wants. McClellan simply, it's what I call Lincoln's general problem. McClellan's generals simply won't take the action he wants them to. Lincoln wants his generals to be aggressive, to go after the Confederacy, believing that he has all the advantage. He does. He has all the advantage. He believes if his generals will just be more aggressive, they can end this conflict. Simply capture the Confederate armies. That's how the Revolution was won. We didn't wipe out all the British. Matter of fact, 85% of all the British that we defeated in in the Revolutionary War, we captured. This is what Lincoln wanted. He wanted a hugely aggressive general to basically go after the Confederacy and capture their armies. And yes, a lot of death would have occurred. A lot of soldiers would have probably died. But generally, no pun intended this time, generally it would have lessened the overall death toll. And he's right, it would have. If this war had been in the first year or two, hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. But his generals wouldn't be the aggressive generals he wanted them to be. It takes him a better part of 3 years to actually get the truly aggressive generals that he wants, that he thinks are necessary to win. But he has to deal with what he's got at the time, and it doesn't work out very well. Now, the war shifts to the Mississippi Valley. Sort of after the attacks on Washington, the attacks on Richmond all fail, we see the next major engagements in the Mississippi Valley sort of in the western part of the Confederacy. Mississippi, Tennessee, that entire region down towards Louisiana. And this is a strategy of the North to cut the South in half. In essence, cut the South. The term you may have heard before is divide and conquer. Cut the Southern Confederacy into pieces, and therefore it'd be much easier to defeat. Plus, if you cut their lines, they can't help each other, and you can basically defeat them in pieces. It's a good strategy, and it does actually work. The divide and conquer strategy of Ohio, Tennessee, and Mississippi rivers. You also see the very first iron-plated boats used in any type of warfare in the world. These ironclad boats. They were wooden boats, but then they bolted, I guess, iron plates to the sides, which made them basically bulletproof and cannon-proof. Cannons would not even penetrate the iron plates. That doesn't mean the cannons still couldn't damage the ship, because cannons explode, and these ships are still wood. So if some fire ends up in a particular place on the ship, the whole ship could burn. But generally speaking, these ships were practically indestructible. They were immune to bullets. They were immune to fire and cannon mostly. Um, and these ironclad boats going up and down the rivers, Mississippi and the Tennessee and Ohio rivers, this really gave the Union an advantage, because the Union was able to move its troops and supplies up and down the rivers, and the Confederacy couldn't do anything about it. Now they do a few things. They do learn to do traps, and they do learn to make basically like floating mines. The Confederacy does use some strategies to try and slow down the Union, but the Union generally controls the rivers due to its larger number of troops, the ironclad boats, um, and it's a strategy that's actually effective. Now this is what Lincoln wanted, though. He wanted generals who would fight and who would be aggressive. Well, we get the Battle of Shiloh, which is a great example. Again, there's hundreds of battles. I'm just mentioning a couple. The Battle of Shiloh is a very interesting one. Um, it was a land and sea battle. We actually saw ships fighting. We saw soldiers coming off of ships that sailed up with the ironclad boats. Uh, Shiloh's battle was so intense that supposedly you could walk the entire battlefield without touching the ground. And of course, why is that? Because of the dead bodies. There were so many dead bodies on the ground at the Shiloh battlefield that you could walk the entire battlefield and never touch the ground, just walking on human corpses. The rivers ran red, literally. The entire rivers around Shiloh were red because there was so much blood. Thousands dead. Yeah. However, this is actually what Lincoln wanted. He wanted generals that were willing to fight and really be very aggressive, and to take the battle to the South to teach them a lesson, to teach them to stop this, to surrender, basically beat them into submission. It didn't work. Even when you got generals that were aggressive, the South would not surrender. Eventually, this does work. The Battle of the Rivers, the Battle of the Mississippi Valley, they do eventually capture New Orleans, and they cut off the western part of the Confederacy. They cut off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. And those three states fall pretty quick. Those three states fall by like 62, 63. Those states have been conquered by the Union. Um, it's a major blow against slavery. Just when they liberated New Orleans, for instance, which was the slave trade capital of the South, the slave trade capital of New Orleans. Just freeing New Orleans freed 50,000 slaves and over 1,000 plantations around New Orleans. It really was the slave capital of the Deep South. So it was a major blow to slavery. It really made a huge point when they liberated New Orleans. They freed all the slaves and they closed up all the plantations. Um, it had a huge impact. It makes a statement. Thing is, it didn't have the desired effect. The desired effect was the South realizes, oh my God, we can't win this. We should just surrender. That was the desired effect. The actual effect was the South actually dug in deeper and became more committed to fighting and defending slavery instead of the opposite. Not really worried about any of these photos here. This gives you an idea of some of the different tactics in the battles and stuff. I'm not really gonna. You can find these in the book if you really want to look them up in the book and look at them on online or on Launchpad or whatever. But it shows Bull Run here. It shows Washington. Is Richmond on here too? There's Richmond. So you see, Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy, and Washington D.C. is right here, which is a different distance of I don't know what. How many miles is that? 80 miles. So the two capitals are 80 miles apart. So for the first year, we have armies milling all around Maryland, Washington, and Virginia, all with the North trying to capture Richmond and the South trying to capture Washington. And neither one were successful. This is the Mississippi Valley battles. We have New Orleans down here. In case you can't see here, the blue is the Union. How much red do you see? Almost none. You have a little bit here. This entire Western campaign to conquer the Mississippi Valley and to divide and conquer the Confederacy is entirely the Union. It was a hands down win, and it was a major strategy that was successful. It helped, but it didn't do what they thought. Lincoln really thought that this would maybe convince the South that what they were doing is futile. They simply needed to give up. They didn't. They were unwilling to do it. All right, let's now talk about total war. This is the first American total war that we've been involved in. Won't be the last. So this is about mobilizing armies and civilians. This is about sort of life on the, we don't use the term yet, but sort of life on the home front, what we'll call it. Now, initially, men on both sides, North and the South, joined readily. Lots of enthusiasm. But as the list of the dead came back, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands dead, the number of people enlisting really drops off dramatically. So in both the North and the South, they have to create a draft. These are the first drafts in American history. This is where we are generally forcing people to enlist into the military to fight the war. In 1862, the CSA forms a draft. Men 18 to 45 would serve 3 years. So even in 62, they were still planning on another 3-year conflict. So 18 to 45 would serve 3 years. However, you could get out of it if you were wealthy because you could provide slaves. If you could provide slaves, probably for labor, then you didn't have to fight. So the rich didn't have to fight. In the North, they do the same kind of thing. The Enrollment Act of 1863 is what it's called, and it forces a draft in 1863. This leads to draft, riots, violence, many people refusing to serve and die in the war, because even if people might have been against slavery or not necessarily supporting slavery, they also were unwilling to go off and fight and die for black people who they didn't know in some other part of the country that had nothing to do with them, that they didn't really care about. As I said before in earlier chapters, most people were simply ambivalent about the issue of slavery. Most people in the North never saw slaves, never dealt with slavery, frankly, didn't care. It didn't matter to them, generally speaking. But you could also get out of it in the North, too. I believe you could pay about $300, which was a lot of money back then. You could pay $300 and you could get out of being drafted. So all through American history, the rich people could always get out of serving in the military. And even today in America, the vast majority of soldiers in the U.S. military are lower socioeconomic level, people from poverty or lower class incomes. Very small percentage of rich and wealthy people ever serve in the military. Draft riots in New York City, for instance, between Irish and German workers. You see harassment. You see lynchings in the streets. You see violence, draft resistance. If anyone's ever seen that movie Gangs of New York, which is an excellent movie, very historically accurate, it takes place in the Five Points region of New York, which is a real place. And the end of the movie, the final fight between the Irish and the Irish Catholics and the German Protestants, which was a real thing, they often would kill each other in the streets. The final battle actually takes place right on top of a Civil War draft riot in 1863. So where the Union military has to actually come in and break up the riot. So we have a draft riot on top of the Irish Catholic versus German Protestant fighting in the streets. It's a bloodbath. That particular riot, which is a real riot that occurred in New York in 63, one of like 3 different ones, took hundreds of lives. Hundreds of men, probably women too, died resisting the government forcing them to join the military. Pretty crazy stuff. What about women in this? Well, we have a couple 100,000 women that actually volunteer. Most volunteer for what is called the Sanitary Commission. Sanitary Commission is the nurses and the healthcare, the dead bodies, dealing with the mortuaries, and no one had any way or way to understand how to deal with hundreds of thousands of dead bodies like this. Identifying them, there were thousands of men that were never identified. I mean, they were literally blown apart. There was no DNA at this time period. There was no dental records. It was almost impossible to identify thousands of bodies that were too mutilated to really know who even them were. Um, Pretty terrible. Women volunteered. Women also volunteered for the Freedmen's Aid Society. That's a term you may not be familiar with yet. Slaves that were freed, a general term used to them was they were called freedmen. This applied to men, women, or children, didn't matter. But if you were a freed slave, you were a freedman. And there were different groups and societies created because you have ultimately millions of slaves that have no idea how to have a normal life, how to get a job, how to have a job, how to get a home, how to pay rent. I mean, all of this is alien to them. So they don't know how to operate in a free society. The Freedmen's Aid Society assists them, tries to help them in different ways. They worked as nurses, clerks, factory operatives. Women did everything during the war. Again, ultimately, millions of men went off to fight. So the women had to fill in a lot of those roles back home on the farm, in the factories, doing all kinds of jobs. Dorothea Dix, which we talked about previously, she was a women's rights advocate. We talked about in previous chapters. She actually is put in charge of the. She's put in charge of the nurses. I don't think she's in charge of the commission. I believe she's in charge of the nurses. She was a superintendent of the female nurses. All other kinds of jobs. Women had all these various jobs: farm workers, factory workers. They had to do all these jobs. But it should also be noted, women also participated in the war. Women worked as spies, scouts, and even a handful of women were soldiers. Women weren't allowed to enlist, so what they did is the women would they would disguise themselves, cut their hair, wrap their breasts, whatever they had to do to be able to pass as a man. Women did this to get away with. So even women fought, although it's a small number. But women are often thought to be innocuous. Innocuous, is that the right word? Harmless. So women could get by as spies. Women could move back and forth across the battle lines. They could move into the north, move to the south. They could spy for the other side. So we do know women often operated as spies during the war or scouts. Here we have a hospital picture. A really good discussion with question 2. If you're a nurse, you have to deal with naked bodies. You have to clean men. You have to clean their genitalia. You have to wipe their butts. You have to clean up all kinds of bodily fluids. This isn't including having to deal with mutilations and amputations and incredible pain and misery and disfigurements and burns. I mean, the kind of stuff that's literally the stuff of nightmares. Many of these women were young women, 16, 18, 20, 22-year-old women which had lived on a farm. They'd never dealt with any of this. They'd never seen naked bodies, naked men. I mean, the kind of stuff these women often had to do is the kind of things they would have never ever imagined doing, or they would have only done with their husband. Touching another man's penis to clean it, for instance. You had to do that kind of stuff with nurses. Um, Imagine the shock to the system. Imagine you're a 17-year-old girl from a small farm, secluded, sort of kept away from society. You're a virgin. You don't even really know exactly what sex is. Uh, and imagine you're thrust into this, and you're now having to do these things for all these men. Just the psychological toll of this would have been tremendous for many of these women. Um, Hundreds of thousands of women served in the Sanitary Commission. They served as nurses in the North, and the Sanitary Commission was in the North. That's just the North. The South also had their own nurses and their own medical staffs and their own commissions dealing with all this kind of stuff. Imagine how it would have changed you. Imagine what your life would have been like afterwards. All the things you had seen. Would you have nightmares? Would it change your whole idea of male-female relations and sexuality? Would it would it make you more promiscuous? That was actually a real concern of having, because most of these women were younger, single women that didn't have families to take care of. Again, if you had a family, you would probably be taking care of your family. The women who could do work full time for the Sanitary Commission didn't have a family to take care of. They weren't mothers yet. So many of them were single or young mothers or young wives. There was a real concern about the women actually having sex with the men. Not every man was mutilated or brutal. Men healed, they got better, they got healthy again, some of them. So there was concerns about relations, a teen pregnancy, unwed pregnancy. That was a huge deal back then. Getting pregnant as an unmarried mother, that was a no-no. It happened obviously, but that was a huge. You could be a social pariah. Your family could disown you. All of the things that go along with this, all the different potential issues of this war on people who are not fighting. That is one of the most misunderstood things about warfare. When we see it on TV and we see it on the History Channel, always sees the one side, that the soldiers fighting and dying. The reality is so much of what happens during a war happens off the battlefield. So much of the changes psychologically, socioculturally, are way beyond two soldiers shooting and killing each other on the battlefield. All the effects upon civilian populations are sometimes just as great as what we see on the battlefield. Think about that. Think about how it would have changed these women's lives and where they go afterwards. Now, there's positive ways to look at it. Maybe they went on to become nurses. Maybe they went on to have a life in the healthcare industry, to help people the rest of their lives. That's possible, some of them. But of course, bear in mind, the goal for a woman in this time period was to get married and have a family. That was the expectation for most women. So where did they go after this? After the war was over? Something to think about. Lots to think about, really. This is also something which really, you look at this chart and you say, well, the war should have been a slam dunk for the North. They had, 60% of the population, 70% of the commodity output, 70% of the farms, 85% of all the factories, most of the roads. In every way, the North had the advantage. If this had been reversed, if this had been the North simply had to protect itself and the South had to defeat the North, it never would have happened. The South would have never stood a chance. We haven't really gotten to it or really covered it, but 98% of all the battles occurred in the South. All the fighting occurred in the South. The South could have never overtaken the North. But the thing is, the North had to overtake the South. And as I said at the beginning, you need a 3-to-1 advantage if you're the aggressor. If you're a defender, your attacker needs to outnumber you 3-to-1 to what we would then call an even playing field. A 3-to-1 advantage if you're the aggressor versus the defender. So all these advantages, which give the North 2 to 3 times advantages, really only evens the playing field. This actually, all the advantages the North has, actually only makes it an even fight. Even though it's deceptive, it's really an even fight now, because the North has to be the aggressor and has to do so much to overcome the South, and the South just has to protect itself. Total war, mobilizing resources. The Northern economy was stronger than the South in every way. I think you saw it on that chart. Greater rail lines, weapons, food, everything. Generally, in every category, the North had 50 to 70% more than the South. Food, roads, people, military, weapons, production, everything. Everything. Cannons, rifles, you name it. Southerners had some stuff. Don't get me wrong. It isn't like, again, 85% versus 15. That means the South did have some factories. The South did have things. The South did have, when the war started, the South had one single ironwork factory in the entire South. By the end of the war, they had multiple. They had several. The North had half a dozen. These are large-scale ironwork factories. Eventually, the South develops their own weapons, their own ironwork technologies. They build more factories. Because the war goes on so long, it actually gives the South time to build up. The war lasts 4.5 years, close to it. It gives the South a lot of time to build factories, to actually build up and to prepare itself for the Northern invasion. And most of the Northern invasions don't occur until after 63. With the exception of the Mississippi Valley, almost all the attacks into the southern states happen after 63. So it gives the South generally 2 years to prepare. Another thing the South had an advantage of was English trade. Much of the southern products they actually traded to England. They were selling their cotton for English goods. England profited off of this war in America by making millions of dollars off of selling goods to the South. As a matter of fact, it was so bad that when the war was over, England apologized to us and actually paid us for it. They made a peace offering and gave us tens of millions of dollars when the war was over as an apology. Sorry, we chose the wrong side. England would have loved to see the South win. Don't get me wrong, England wasn't pro-slave. England was against slavery. They'd outlawed slavery back in like 1807. But what this England would have seen was, by the South winning, England would have actually, it would have crippled the United States. It would have put us into two smaller countries. And we were now becoming maybe the most significant global economic competitor for England. They would have loved to see the U.S. crippled. They would have loved to see our economy not destroyed, because we were big trade partners. They didn't want our economy destroyed, but they would have loved to see our ability to globally trade and ship crippled, which would have certainly happened during the war and as a result of the war. So they chose sides, and they chose the South. Not because of slavery, but for probably purely economic reasons. Anyway, they apologized afterwards, gave us millions of dollars, and said sorry. Anyway, that's an advantage the South had because England did buy products from them and give products to them, and they traded with them. So it was certainly an advantage. The Homestead Act is passed in 62. This boosts farm production. It gives all kinds of free land out in the West. It's called free. It's not really free, but it is so cheap. You can go out and buy an entire farm for a couple bucks. No shit. You could buy a whole, and don't get me wrong, it's just the land. You're just buying a bare piece of land, or maybe whatever it is, you got to cut trees or whatever you got to do. But you can buy basically farmland to build a farm for a handful of dollars. So it's called free land, practically. You still got to do all the work. You got to plant the crops, cut the trees, bring the animals, you got to build a house, etc. But they really wanted to boost farm production, and this became one of the number one sources of revenue during the war. During the Civil War, the U.S. government generated millions of dollars by selling off Western lands. It needs to be noted, almost all the fighting was done in the South. Almost all the battles were in the South. The Northern Union and pretty much the whole rest of the U.S., all the way to the West, all the way to California, most of that just continued moving on like normal. It's really interesting. While the war was being fought brutally, thousands dying every day, in 70% of the country, life went on as normal. People kept farming, went about their jobs, building the railroads, doing their mining. The western half of the U.S., life generally didn't change during the war. Even if the South had won and we had lost those southern states, the rest of the United States would have continued to grow and expand and prosper and would have quickly eclipsed the South. Because the South was a dozen states. The rest of the U.S. eventually would have becomes another 38 states eventually in later years. So, and who knows? Even if the South had won, slavery was going away in the rest of the world. Slavery was almost over in pretty much the whole globe. We were one of the last places in the world to still have slavery. Give it another couple generations, it's certainly conceivable that the South would have actually rejoined the Union when slavery was ended. And slavery would have eventually ended at some point. And, 100 years later, everything might have actually been back to normal. We might have had a full United States again. Certainly possible. But the point is, the U.S. just kept right on trucking. Even though the war is going, people are dying, the rest of the country continues to move like normal. And they also complete the railroad. They complete the Transcontinental Railroad around 62. where it actually connects New York to San Francisco, and we have a train line across the whole country that keeps going on. I think that's actually connected in Utah, maybe, where they put in what's called the Golden Spike. I don't know if it's actually gold. Probably was, whatever. Anyway, they put the Golden Spike. They probably then pried it back up and put it in a museum or something. But nonetheless, which connected the East and the West. We need increased food production, mining production to feed ultimately millions of soldiers. So we see expanded mining, expanded railroads, expanded farming, expanding industrial production. This also capitalism keeps right on trucking along, even during the war. We see government subsidized production of industry and factories. We really see the first real wave of American millionaires. We see the first batches of American millionaires and capitalistic growth. This is the beginning of that era of those, you've seen the shows on TV, the men who built America. This is really where the first fortunes are won. These men make massive amounts of money and profit off of, I'm not going to say necessarily just the war, but yes, really, as a result of the war, we see dozens of our first big millionaires in America created, basically off of all the military production. They're making all this wealth because America continues to expand. Now in the South, it's shit. In the South, it's exactly the other way around. The United States economy continues to grow and boom during the war. The Southern economy continues to shrink and really implode in upon itself. The CSA left all economic matters to the states. Again, they're states' rights, right? It's all about states' rights. The states have the right to secede. The states have a right to have slaves. So instead of creating a national government in the South, the Confederacy, they basically have a dozen state governments. It's a confederation. You've literally gone back a century to some version of the Articles of Confederation. They've gone back in time 100 years, is really how they're running their society. What that also means, they can't tax. They can't use federal money to build armories or shipyards or iron factories. Eventually, the government does step in and start taking some action. But for the first couple of years, it's pretty much just leaving the states to take care of themselves, which is what they were arguing. It's all about states' rights. The weird irony is, by the end of the war, there's a federal government in the South that is doing everything, even though their entire argument was the federal government shouldn't do anything. Again, this is the Confederacy federal government. And by the end of the war, they were actually enlisting slaves into the Confederate Army. Yeah. All of their ideals, all of their language, all of their high political ideals of independence and states' rights and all this kind of stuff, all of it goes out the window by the end of the war. And we now have massive taxation, an entire federal government. They're freeing the slaves to fight as soldiers. Yeah, so ultimately the South has to resort to commandeering, coercion. Again, they're unwilling to tax. They run out of natural resources. They run out of metals. There's very few mines in the South. A lot of their mining comes out of West Virginia. Halfway through the war, they lose West Virginia. That becomes occupied by the Union. Where was all the money? By the way, it should be noted, the South had more money than the North. Where was all their money? It was all in the hands of rich farmers. It wasn't in factories. It wasn't in industry. It wasn't in cities. It was basically in ships on the dock and all of their trade revenue, all of their agricultural products. It was all in the hands of these rich-owning elites, these rich-owning people. And by the way, who doesn't want to pay taxes? Is the rich. Who runs the government in the CSA? The rich. So there you go. The rich people are running the government, and the rich people are the ones who most don't want to pay taxes, and the rich people are the ones who can get away without paying taxes. And so the rich, who wanted to hold on to the slave society more than anyone, the wealthy landowners and farmers and plantation owners, are also the ones who could have really driven the economy. They could have really boosted the Southern economy if they'd taken all that slave profits, all that money, and really funneled it into the economy. They could have had a massive boost to the Southern economy, which might have actually let them win the war. But instead, they hoarded all their money and held on to it because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to hoard their money and be rich and wealthy and powerful. They didn't want to lose all their money because losing the slaves would have equated losing all the money. So it's almost like a snake eating itself. You want to be successful and powerful and hold on to all your money, but you needed to spend that money to maintain your independence where you could make more money. So to hold on to slave society, and they were unwilling to do it. So ultimately, the Southern economy just collapses. It completely implodes upon itself. By the end of the war, the money's useless. There's Confederate bills, Confederate dollars, but they're useless. They're literally more useful to throw in the fireplace. The money's worthless. Riots, food riots, clothing riots, shoe riots, because there's no shoes. You can't buy shoes anymore. There's no shoe production. Um, Riots for everything. Draft riots. The entire South just starts to implode upon itself, and the whole thing just starts to collapse. The whole economy collapses. By the end of the war, there really was no Southern economy. It was literally just a matter of getting the leaders of the South to finally surrender because they lost. They lost 2 years before this war was over. 2 years before it ended, the South had already really lost. They just were unwilling to wave the flag and surrender. And as a result, people kept having to fight and die, and hundreds of thousands more died, even though the South had really already lost. They just would not give up. Here we have a Southern refugee family. Here we have what's the action here? We have a woman, a wagon, her horses. She's basically trying to escape before probably an army coming. There's probably news of fighting nearby, and so she's packed up her wagon. She has her kids up on top. I think it's interesting. The kid is actually wearing a hat, which is probably a Confederate soldier hat. He's too young to fight, although maybe not. A lot of young boys did fight. He's probably younger than what you would have seen. But you got to wonder where he got the hat from. Probably off of some nearby battlefield that he was just scrounging through with dead bodies everywhere, and he just took the hat or the jacket and the clothes off of some dead soldier. Hundreds of thousands of bodies were just left on fields all across America. Well, across the South, mostly across the South, because they couldn't pick up the bodies. Some battlefields still had bodies laying on them a month after the battle. There was no one to pick up the bodies. No one knew what to do with the bodies. They couldn't identify the bodies. They didn't know where they were from. I mean, if you're in the South and you got a battlefield littered with Union bodies, do you want to pick them up? I mean, like, they're the enemy, right? That's the enemy soldiers. We don't care about them. Let the birds and the wolves eat them. We don't care. That happened all the time. Uh, so here's this woman escaping, trying to run away. She's by herself probably because her husband or father, or in this case, probably her husband or sons, are away fighting, dying. Many times these women were just left. They were left to fend for themselves, while the millions of soldiers were away fighting for a cause that, truthfully, by the end of the war, most did not believe in. It was simply, by the end of the war, it was really just fighting to end it. People just wanted it to end. The South would not surrender, though. The last 2 years of this war brought incredible amount of needless suffering and misery due to the South's unwillingness to simply give up and simply say, all right, it's over. That word there is emancipation, if it's a little bit covered up. 1863 is often considered to be the turning point of the war. As the war continues into its third year, abolitionists start to demand slave emancipation. In other words, freeing the slaves. This was not on Lincoln's agenda early on. Lincoln had no interest in freeing the slaves. Matter of fact, he claimed he would not. He said, I will not free the slaves back in 61. And he said this probably mostly to appease the South and say, if you simply come back, if you simply rejoin, I won't free any slaves. Your slave society is intact. Now, you have to understand, Lincoln didn't make that decision necessarily. Congress is probably the one's going to make that decision. And Congress had actually already made it clear they were pretty much done with slavery. So even if Lincoln's promise was true, that he was not going to end slavery, Congress might have done something different. So by 63, though, the tide of war has changed. People in the North are seeing us starting to win some battles. We've cut off the entire western part of the CSA. And they now determined that winning the war is also probably now synonymous with ending slavery. 61, it was not. By 63, ending the war and ending slavery generally seemed to be tied together, even though it didn't begin that way. Now, slaves who did escape were often called contraband of war. A contraband is something you get from an enemy. Basically, it's enemy goods or supplies. So these slaves are considered contraband. They're not free. You must understand, until 63, all these slaves that had been freed in like New Orleans, for instance, or in these conquered territories like Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana, they're technically still slaves. They're not free. They are still technically property of someone else. It is contraband. So when you have freed slaves that are in the North, you've got these escaped slaves, or you freed or closed plantations and you freed all these slaves, 50,000 in New Orleans, those are still technically 50,000 slaves. They're not freed under the law. They're still someone's property. Well, that's why they're called contraband. Well, all these now we have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of freed slaves, or effectively free slaves. And we start actually talking about what are we going to do with all of them. So the North actually passes some laws, Confiscation Act of 61, Confiscation Act of 62, which authorizes taking all these slaves, property in general. You can confiscate and take property, which could be food, could be clothes, could be wagons, could be ammunition, could be crops, doesn't matter, whatever. This authorizes the Union to pretty much take anything it needs from the Confederacy. Anywhere it goes, any state or territory it invades, it can simply take all their stuff and use it for the Union Army. Food, animals, whatever. Well, this also includes slaves, because slaves are technically still property. This authorizes this, all to support the Union's fighting of the war. But by 63, the idea of emancipation, it really becomes what we start to call a war measure. Lincoln really calls it this. It is something that now becomes associated with the war. If we're going to end slavery, if we're going to end the war, well, we've gone through all this, we might as well just end slavery too. It was not designed to punish the South. Southerners would say different. Southerners would say emancipation and this war measure of ending slavery was simply to punish the South. It was not. If the South had not actually created this war, slavery would have probably gone on for many more years. Yes, it would have eventually ended. It would have had to. There is no slavery in the world today. Hasn't been really in a century. But official slavery. There are slaves, but not official slavery. But it seems pretty obvious that the Republicans have now made this their focus. The Republicans who control Congress have decided to start passing legislation to end or outlaw slavery. They end slavery in all the Western territories, all the Western U.S., all the way to California. They outlaw it and pretty much state that any new territory will not have slavery. Any free territory from the Confederacy will potentially not have slavery. So Congress is already on the path to ending slavery, even though Lincoln is not 100% on board with it yet. Well, initially, again, he rejected it. He rejected it for two reasons. One, he said ending slavery was not part of the war effort. He simply wanted the war to end. Again, in the beginning, he even told those border states, all those border states got to keep their slaves. So ending slavery really was not anything to do with the war initially, as far as Lincoln was concerned. He also didn't believe blacks were equal to whites. He continued to stress, even into his presidency, what are we going to do in America with millions of freed slaves? How are they going to assimilate into our society? He didn't understand how millions of free blacks could suddenly become part of free white society. He argued that even after he was president, he argued this to other politicians and to Congress. So he was uncertain about it. However, by 62, it really becomes sort of linked. Everyone in the Republican Party is pretty much wanting to end slavery. Lincoln jumps on board with it, realizing that it is probably the most efficient way forward. And if we are going to go through all this pain and suffering and actually end the war, well, if we're going to end the war, we might as well get rid of slavery too. Not necessarily, again, for pro-black reasons. More for, in his own words, to ensure we do not have a perpetuation of this violence in the future. In other words, We're going to end the war in slavery to ensure there's not another war in the future. Potentially, if slavery didn't end and slavery maintained, we would continue to have two separate societies, which could actually open the door up for further conflict in the future. So he was really thinking more long term, ending slavery now, putting all of America on one page could potentially lessen future conflict. Generally, Congress sees this. We see tens of thousands of more contraband coming in. These are slaves, these are freedmen. Um, and again, his argument is still the same. Slavery simply needs to be decided. Either the whole country is slave, the whole country is free. Seems pretty obvious by this point the way it's going to go is the whole country free. And in January of 63, he issues an ultimatum. He writes this in conjunction with a few people in Congress. I believe he even does it with I think Stephen Douglas even weighs in on this. Don't quote me on that, but I think he does. And he issues this, what becomes known as the Emancipation Proclamation, which is given a lot more credit than it's necessarily due. The Emancipation Proclamation actually doesn't do anything. It really doesn't. He issues this January 1st of 63, and he issues the order which says simply, any state which rejoins the Union or is part of the Union now gets to keep their slaves. That's exactly what it says. You can look it up. If you are in the Union now, or if you come back and rejoin the Union, a Confederate state, you get to keep all your slaves who are not in slavery. However, anyone who does not come back by the end of the month, January 31st, I guess, anyone who does not come back by the end of the month will then have all your slaves freed whenever the war ends or whenever we take your territory. So join now, keep your slaves, or wait, and then whenever we do come and conquer your territory or take your slaves from you, they're all going to be freed. Really interesting. So this allows states to keep slavery if they join the Union, or if they're already in the Union, like those border states, they get to keep their slaves as well. He considers this an act of justice. He believes this will definitely damage the CSA. He hopes states will return. None do. Not a single state comes back. None of them choose to rejoin. He does often think that this is how he'll be remembered, is the emancipation. He thinks this will be how you're remembered through history, and often it is. It's hugely significant. But this doesn't actually end slavery in any way. No, it's the 13th Amendment that ends slavery. It doesn't come about for another 2 years. Emancipation is really just it's an executive order with no real power that sort of is just a policy statement. Really just a policy statement that, either you rejoin the Union or we're going to punish you by taking all your slaves from you. But if you come back, you get to keep them. It's interesting. None rejoin and the war continues on. However, it is significant in the fact that it does set a precedent for what happens 2 years later, which actually does end slavery, the 13th Amendment. And it also it allows the Union Army to actually be what we call a force of emancipation, meaning effectively, once the emancipation is in action, anywhere the Union Army goes in the South, they're actually spreading freedom. That it's a moral thing. It's an ideological thing. Wherever the Union Army goes, anywhere that they conquer territory, those slaves are now technically free. So that's interesting. How it has more of this moral ideological effect, but the actual effect of freedmen is really limited. It does not actually free anybody really at the time of the emancipation. The effect later on is significant. General Grant is one of the generals for the Union. General Grant sought to split the Confederate Army. He marched into Arkansas. He marched into Mississippi. He defeated 2 CSA armies. And then 6 weeks later, he captured Vicksburg. He then took regions of Louisiana. He took the Mississippi River. He basically cut the CSA in half. Now, this is that whole battle for the Mississippi Valley we talked about, 40 minutes ago. But it's important to understand who Grant is, because Grant plays a very significant role in American history, the war, and American history after this. Grant is the lead general, and there's other generals, but he's the lead general that really makes this happen. He's the one that really cuts off Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas from the Confederacy. And by 62, 63, either all or parts of these states have been conquered by the Union. However, the Confederacy keeps on fighting. Slaves in these states were often freed, even though they might not have technically been free until after the Emancipation. And even then, it's a gray area whether they're really free or not. Um, they're free effectively because there's no more Confederate soldiers to stop them. The plantation owners know they have no power anymore, therefore they can't keep the slaves. So even if legally they may not be free, even if they're generally contrabands, effectively they're free. Effectively, many of these slaves can try to start their lives as free men and women. So the capture of Vicksburg, which was one of the largest cities in the Confederacy, really starts to turn the war. Again, this is the turning point. 63, the battles in 63, the Gettysburg Address, we're going to talk about here in a minute, the Emancipation Proclamation, all these things together really prove, without a doubt, at least for most people, that the South has lost the war. However, it's 2 years before the South finally surrenders. Even though, for all intents and purposes, the South has already lost. But they refuse to surrender, and of course, thousands more die. Lee was left with few options. He felt that he should attack into the North. All the attacks up to this point had really been in the South. Lee decides he thinks a strategy is to take the battle to the Union, to actually attack the Union, to go into the North. He decides to do this. He believes with Grant in the South. Grant is one of the most aggressive generals in this point in time. He believes with Grant in the South, there's possible two results here. One, either he goes to the North and he wins a decisive victory. He captures a major city. I mean, Washington might be out, but he could still capture a major city, a really significant port or an iron yard, an iron works or something like that, to really deal a blow to the Union. Or the other possible result was he would do enough damage in the North to draw General Grant and his large army. And Grant had thousands of soldiers, an army that was twice the size of anything the Confederacy had. He would actually draw Grant out of the South to go back to the North. Either one would be a win. Either one of those would be a victory. That was an idea. So we have generals moving around Pennsylvania. We have General Lee attacking up into Pennsylvania, which is a free territory. Now, this was not necessarily the target. Gettysburg really wasn't big. Gettysburg was a small town. It really was not significant. This was not Lee's plan. Lee did not intend to get bogged down into a major battle, which was the largest battle of the entire war. He didn't intend to get bogged down in this, what becomes the biggest battle of the war, around Gettysburg. It was accidental. Ultimately, there were actually 7 separate armies milling around central Pennsylvania, both Confederate and Union. Confederacy heading north, Union armies were actually moving into the south. This was not a planned engagement. It was actually sort of accidental. A couple of these armies ran into each other a few miles outside of Gettysburg. The battle then spills over in involving other armies. And this is a battle which lasts about 3 days. I think it's 3 days. 55,000 dead. The greatest loss of life of any battle. Actually lasts more than 3 days. I think it actually lasts several more than that. Don't quote me on the amount of days. And it was never planned. This really was terrible for Lee. Technically, it's a Union victory, although more Union soldiers die, because Lee has to retreat. This was not what he planned. He wanted to go and have a major decisive victory in the North or draw Grant out of the South. Neither happened. He doesn't get a decisive victory. Even if he won Gettysburg, even if he had, it was really inconsequential. It was not a significant location or position. And he did not succeed in pulling Grant out of the South. It didn't really work. So the two major armies in this were General Lee and General Meade, although it has to be understood altogether there was about 7 different generals in this, 7 different armies. This becomes the deadliest battle of the war. The Union technically won this because Lee had to retreat, but the number of losses were terrible. The Confederacy lost about 30,000 soldiers. Union lost about 25,000 soldiers. These are dead. These aren't casualties. These are actual dead. And finally, Lee does retreat. General Meade let him go. General Meade did not pursue Lee, even though he could have. He could have pursued Lee, might have even captured him. We don't know. But Meade didn't. Meade wrote about it afterwards or during, and he wrote that it was simply too tragic. There was too much death, too much violence, too much killing. He didn't want it to continue. Because had he chosen to pursue Lee, it would have probably been a several day long engagement, basically chasing him, running him, trying to run his army down, which would have probably resulted in hundreds or thousands more dead. Um, and Meade chose to not do this. Meade chose to not go and get Lee, and he might have ended the war right here. It's sort of like in the Revolutionary War. Had the British ever captured Washington, we would have probably lost the war, just right there. Had the North ever managed to capture Lee and his army, we would have probably won the war. That would have probably been it. But he didn't do it. He had a chance there to win, and he probably did not do. He was so dismayed by the carnage and destruction, he simply let it go. So this was really the last effort by the CSA. These two battles, the Battle of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg, are probably the turning point of the war, and after this, the North never really looked back. That was really a freight train rolling downhill. There was no way to stop the North from winning this conflict other than the North simply giving up. And some people feared that might actually happen. Even though we were undoubtedly winning, the South couldn't win by this point. After Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the South was simply trying to stay alive. Again, very much like Washington. Lee spent the last year and a half of this war just running. Fighting, engaging, and retreating. Fighting, engaging, retreating. And that's what he does for over a year. Same thing Washington did. And that's how come the war kept drawing on. So the only way to win at this point would have been simply for the North to give up, to stop. And they don't. Although there is some concern that it might happen. We'll talk about that here in a moment. This gives you an idea. Some of the deadly battles here: Pickett's Charge, Cemetery Ridge. I've been to the Gettysburg battlefield. They've got, it's a national cemetery with the white crosses everywhere. As far as the eye can see, it's numbing. It is so, it's hard to understand really, unless you've been there and actually seen it and walked it. Anyway, it makes you really think about human life and how war devalues human life. Anyway, yeah. So this gives you just some ideas. You can obviously pause this and have a look at it if you want. Black soldiers in the Union Army. By 63, the Union was enlisting black soldiers. Many volunteered. Many actually didn't get paid. Many actually were really volunteer, no pay at all. What do you think these black soldiers thought? Think about that. It's a good discussion question. What did they think when they chose to join the Union, chose to fight against the Confederacy? I mean, some of them are smiling. Anytime you see a young soldier smiling, again, I'm from the military. Anytime you see a young soldier smiling, all you immediately think is, God, they're an idiot. What are you smiling for? Tomorrow, you could have your face blown off, or the friend next to you could have his arm blown off. So, I mean, what are you smiling for, really? You don't really understand what you're doing if you're smiling. Anyway, so what do these black soldiers think? What do you think what do you think they're thinking about this? I'm going to leave it open. I'm not going to give you lots of information on this. I'm going to really sort of leave it open. What are they thinking? Consider all the different things. Consider all the situations been going on. Consider, what they could be fighting for. What they volunteered for. Why? Furthermore, most of the army's white. Think about what the other white soldiers think about the black soldiers. Think about that. A couple different ways to look at that. There's positive and negative ways to look at this. Think about the white people in the North when they see the black soldiers marching through. Okay. Now, think about the white Southerners when they see the black. Again, this is before the South is recruiting slaves. This is when the South, CSA is still just white men. This is where the South has got really desperate. So think about this in 63 when they see black soldiers marching with guns in the southern states. Think about the kind of fits, the kind of people just literally shitting themselves. Black men marching freely with loaded weapons. Pretty much what the South had been fighting against for 2 centuries. Imagine what Southern whites thought when they saw Union armies marching in with entire squads and platoons of black soldiers armed. So think about the black soldiers, the white soldiers. Think about the Southern whites. Think about Northern whites. Think about all of it, and think about what people would imagine, or what people their reactions would be to this squad of black soldiers. I'll tell you, the reactions would have been strong either way, positive or negative. They would have been very strong. Let's see what else we got here. All right, Union victorious. All right, the impact of black troops. The last 2 years of the war were essentially the South just trying to stay alive due to overwhelming odds. The North continued to chip away at the South. The North, by the end of the war, had 5 times more soldiers. Their industry was 5 times greater. Overwhelming odds. The South simply hoped the North would lose interest, or public opinion would shift, or Lincoln would lose the election in 64. If public opinion shifted, if the North simply lost interest in this, if Lincoln lost the election in 64, lots of things could change. This is what the South is hoping for. They're pretty much putting all their hopes on one of those things happening. Well, lots of changing attitudes. Black soldiers were very impactful. Early on, we saw Southern whites generally offended by the idea of blacks in uniform. Either they're resistant to them, or they did force them to be volunteer, non-paid, or they didn't like the fact that these were black men wearing American military uniforms. Later on in the war, though, the attitude does seem to change. Later on in the war, some people start to think maybe this makes sense. We're fighting to end slavery. We're fighting to free slaves. Doesn't it make sense to have black soldiers actually doing the fighting and dying? So early on, lots of resistance. But later on in the war, as the war wore on year after year, less resistance, less attitude against blacks. The Emancipation Proclamation certainly changes attitude. Many people start to accept that it's sort of appropriate for black people, black men, to be fighting for this effort, which is to free blacks. Sort of makes sense. Some people had changing attitude after the apparent willingness of blacks to fight and die for the cause. For instance, 54th Massachusetts Infantry at Fort Wagner. In 1863, the 54th Mass, this was a black infantry unit, they stormed Fort Wagner, and they were told ahead of time that this was probably a suicide attack, that many of them would die, and they did it anyway. They volunteered, they stormed it. About 75% of them did die. Not all, but about 75% did die. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, which was it's 20 years old, but it's an excellent movie. Excellent all-star cast, at least for the 1990s. Yeah, that's the story. That's the story of the 54th Mass. Critical and changing perspectives on black soldiers. Many people believe that their bravery and willingness to die for the Northern cause, basically to end slavery, it really changed a lot of opinions of blacks and Africans in general in the North for many people. By 1865, there were over 200,000 free blacks in the Union Army. Don't get me wrong, they weren't all armed. They weren't all frontline infantrymen. It was still common for black men to get very menial jobs, the ones that dig the ditches, dig the latrines, that's the bathrooms, the ones that do kitchen duty. It was still common for blacks to get the more menial jobs, but we do see multiple black infantry units that did actually get fully armed and fought in war, full action. We do see that. We do see, ironically, probably this fear. It really is a weird irony. The total fear of what the Southerners had been afraid of for 2 centuries, of blacks being given respect, being given weapons, of a black rebellion rising up and overthrowing the white master race. It's exactly what happened. Everything the Southerners didn't want to happen, they actually caused to happen by the war. The war created all this that might have never played out like this. Some historians have suggested that slavery might have existed for another 30 years in the South. Because we actually don't see slavery end in, like, let's see, like Cuba and Brazil, slavery doesn't end until the 1890s. So for 30 more years, slavery continues in several countries in the Western Hemisphere. So Southerners might have got another 1 or 2 generations out of slavery had they not done this war. Maybe. It's hard to know. Capable generals finally do take command. Ulysses S. Grant takes over the entire army in 1864. He becomes the commanding general of the U.S. Army under Lincoln. And finally, Lincoln gets what he wants. He gets a general who is willing to be ruthless, brutal, willing to sacrifice anything for a win. He gets what he wants, finally, with Grant. Had Grant been the general from the beginning, this war would have been much shorter. Pretty much everyone agrees on that. Had Grant's tactics been employed since 1861, this war would have been much shorter. Probably, we think, anyway. His tactic was simple, using the large number of troops and military supplies and money at his command to simply overwhelm the South with numbers, to simply hit the South with multiple armies numbering in the tens of thousands and simply beat them into submission. It finally happens. They start taking all the major cities, they start attacking all the armies. By 1864, the Union Army outnumbers the Confederacy by 6-1. 6 times more soldiers. They have multiple armies in the field. Each army is bigger than the entire Union, the entire Confederate army. Every single soldier Lee has. Pretty much everywhere they go, they start conquering every city. They start taking every waterway, every shipyard, every train yard, every ironworks. They have almost no losses. Don't get me wrong, many people are dying. Many soldiers are dying tragically, but there's very few losses of Union armies. It becomes a very disruptive total war on the South. And the war also takes a new change. Grant starts actually having civilian targets. Grant starts attacking civilian positions. And the reason for this is simple, and this is why modern war they often attack civilian targets in modern warfare. Even though civilians might seem innocent, and many of them are, hands down, where do the soldiers get the food from? The civilians. Where do they get their clothes from? Where do they get the munitions? The soldiers aren't out there in the field making bullets. The soldiers aren't out there in the field making their own food and hunting. They get the food, the supplies, their salaries. They get all that from the civilian world. The civilian, the government, all of the infrastructure of society is what allows the soldiers to fight in the field. Therefore, Grant's strategy is simple. Cut off all their supplies. Stop the cities, destroy the train lines, burn the cities, burn all the crops, burn the forest, kill all the animals. In essence, cut off all their supplies and capabilities so the soldiers run out of food, they run out of weapons, they run out of bullets, they run out of gunpowder, and eventually, of course, they run out of morale and they simply give up. That's the strategy. That's the strategy Lincoln has wanted since '61, but he's never had generals willing to really wage total war. Finally, he gets it with Grant and Sherman. He finally gets generals willing to do anything to finally bring this war to an end. Grant normally loses in most battles twice as many soldiers as the Confederacy. He normally loses twice as many troops. He just throws his soldiers at the Confederacy to overwhelm them. And it works. Pretty much every battle, the Confederacy retreats. Grant never loses one single battle. Not one. He simply overwhelms the Confederacy, and the Confederacy is either slaughtered to a man, or they surrender, or they retreat. Every time against Grant. This is where we really have to start talking about the strategy of, it's sometimes referred to as the less loss of life strategy. What strategy will result in, ultimately, when it's all done, the lowest loss of human life? A more slower, protracted war. Hi, puppy. Hi there, puppy. Here's my puppy. A slower, protracted war that lasts for years and has a massive death toll that is incremental and slowly building, but yet becomes huge because it lasts for years, or a massive immediate death toll, which looks brutal and terrible, but in the long run, actually fewer deaths. And that's the strategy. And the strategy that becomes Grant's strategy and Sherman's strategy is to basically kill everything, don't preserve any lives, even their own Union soldiers. He throws his soldiers at battles that are, his men get slaughtered, dying 2 and 3 times as many as the Confederacy. But he's got so many more men, he decides, him and Lincoln and his generals, they eventually come to the conclusion that they are not going to preserve life today because the war is going to be prolonged. Ultimately, it will preserve life in the future to end this conflict and get the war, get country moving forward. That's the idea. That is a strategy which really governs the Union's aggression for the last year of this conflict. Kill them all, and eventually they're simply going to give up. Because the strategy of preservation of life had been going on for 4 years now, and the war's still going. This more incremental strategy had been leading most of the generals for years, including McClellan for over 2 years leading the army. And look where it got us. Hundreds thousand dead, the entire country in turmoil, and we're literally no closer to the end than we were 3 years ago. This becomes strategy. Grant leads an offensive towards Richmond. His goal is to simply capture Richmond and end the war. And he does eventually. That's his goal, his strategy, to simply get Richmond and end this, to end the conflict. Pretty rough. 1864, the 4th year of the war, the pace of the war was slowing. The only offensive armies that still existed was the Union. The Confederate armies were simply running, retreating, or hiding, or they had gone into a couple cities and barricaded themselves in the cities and basically were trying to defend the cities. They'd given up on the countryside, given up on the people, given up on the plantations, the farms, all the small towns. All they cared about was a couple of major cities, like Richmond, for instance, or Atlanta, for instance. That's all that mattered. They didn't care about anything else. The psychological toll was brutal. The physical toll was brutal. Hundreds of thousands dead. Grant's total war is sometimes referred to as scorched earth. Literally destroyed everything. He burned cities to the ground, burned every farm, killed every animal, torched every forest. To where when Grant left a region, there was nothing left to sustain life. Now, this obviously crippled the army, but it also did massive damage to the civilian population. Thousands of civilians died, or after Grant went through, they would starve to death because all the crops were gone, all the animals were dead, all the produce was destroyed. The rivers were polluted, the cities were burned down, their homes were burned down. This was total war devastation that we don't see anything like this again until really World War I. Another, 60 years after this, 50 years after this? We don't see anything like this again for half a century, this type of devastation. Now, the Union and Lincoln says it was necessary because 4 years in and the South still won't surrender, even though they've lost. The war's over. I mean, they've lost. There's literally nothing they could do at this point to win. It's done. But they still won't give up. Jefferson Davis won't surrender. The Confederate Congress won't surrender, and Robert E. Lee won't surrender. So until those 3 things happen, the war has to continue. So by the last year of the war, this devastation that was brought on the South, they really brought it upon themselves. Or really the leadership brought it upon them. Really is really what did it. The death toll is enormous. The disruption, the anything goes, the retribution, the murders, the violence, the rapes, mutilations. We see people being tortured, and we see people being brutally killed. This total war, which really lasts almost the entire last year of the war, almost the entire last year is this scorched earth that Sherman and Grant do in the South. It's terrible. Sherman and Grant and Lincoln would argue it was necessary. Many in the South would disagree. This is actually Grant right here, leaning over a church pew out in the open. Makes you wonder, where's the church? Probably in ruins. They probably dragged the pews outside after the church had been bombed or destroyed by cannons. We have wagons here. We have supplies. This is his officers. Basically, this is his officer corps. These are his officers, his scouts, his other, majors and lieutenants and captains and all that. But this is Grant actually leaning over the pew with a couple of his officers here, probably looking at maps. It's a strategic planning meeting where they're planning their strategy, whatever the next step is. And they're taking a break. You can see most of them are horse officers. You can tell by their boots. The ones that have the boots that go up to the knees, those are cavalry officers. Now, most officers rode on horses, so most officers had that type of attire. But the cav or the officers would ride on horses while the soldiers marched. It's the way it's always been, really. Even in modern times, before really modern times, before the last 30 or 40 years, even all the way back to the Korean War, even Vietnam, the generals rode around in helicopters and jeeps, and the soldiers marched. The life of an infantry grunt. Yeah, men, horses, wagons, uniforms, swords, guns, maps. They're reading newspapers. You can see a couple of them have sabers attached to their hips. They have those are swords that cavalry often would carry. They would carry swords still. Um, all the accoutrements of war. The Union victorious, finally at the end. The election of '64 scared a lot of people in the Republican Party. Many people were now tired of the war. It's called war. Is it called war weariness? Maybe is the term to use. Even if you were against the Confederacy, even if you were pro-abolition, you wanted to end slavery, etc., etc. 4 years in, many people were simply tired of this. They wanted it to end. And some people believed the Confederacy would never surrender. And so there was a real concern in the election of '64. What if Lincoln lost? And what if a Democrat won? Because there were Northern Democrats or even less warlike Republicans. So if someone won who was not Lincoln, Lincoln feared and his generals feared that they might simply surrender and end it. Surrender is the wrong word. Call a truce. They would simply call a truce and end the war. Some people believe this. Lincoln by '64 decided very clearly the only way to end this war was to end it with a Union victorious and slavery over. It was very clear by '64 he had made up his mind. Slavery had to end. Union had to win. End of story. At any cost, meaning human life. Any cost. Union had to win. Slavery had to end. It was just that simple. So he chooses a Democrat as a running mate. There's no rule that says you have to choose a same party person. Like today, if a Republican runs, they choose a Republican president, VP, Democrat, president, VP. That's the way it works. You don't have to do that. There's no rule that says that. A Democrat presidential nominee could choose a Republican running mate. That would never happen today. Lincoln does this. Lincoln chooses a Democrat as his as his VP candidate. Why? Very simple. He wants to get Democratic votes. So he wants to get the Republican votes from the Republican Party, and by choosing a Democrat as a running mate, he's hoping to bring Democratic votes over so he wins. This has incredibly significant repercussions. Spoiler alert, Lincoln's going to get killed, and when Lincoln gets assassinated, that makes the new president a Democrat. Incredibly significant repercussions of this. At the time, Lincoln did it for political reasons to help ensure his reelection. It's unfortunate. Really, really, really would have been better had he chosen a Republican. Admittedly, he had to win the election first. And of course, he didn't expect to get shot in the head. Unfortunately, this decision right here, this fateful decision to choose a Democratic running really changes American history. It really does. Simply this one decision, if he chose a Republican, would have changed American history dramatically. Probably. Possibly in a couple of different possible ways, nonetheless. He chose the Democrat, hoping it will be increase his chances of winning election. He does win. He wins re-election. All right, so the election is getting close. Sherman advances on Atlanta. General Sherman advances on Atlanta, which is the second largest city in the CSA. Really the only major city left that had to be conquered before going for Richmond. He couldn't take it quickly. It takes him months. Takes him several months to actually conquer Atlanta. He surrounds it, cuts off the train lines, but the armies in Atlanta are unwilling to give up. Finally, he cuts the rail lines. He forces the general to actually run from the city. The general flees, and he's able to conquer Atlanta. This was major. This happens right before the election. And with the conquering of Atlanta, this really proves to many people that the war is about over. Really, the only major city left is Richmond itself. So many people believe, well, Lincoln he's done it really. Lincoln has basically almost ended the war. There can't be much left. So this does help him get reelected. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of soldiers. We believe, and I don't know where the statistic comes from. I don't know what researchers have been done into this. I haven't done it personally. But we believe almost all Union soldiers voted for Lincoln, even though there was other options. So we think between the Union soldiers and the northern population of Republicans and Democrats, Lincoln wins. He wins the election and he wins re-election. Many people now believe there is an end to the war in sight. Lincoln has committed to end the war, ending slavery. The Southerners now already using slaves in their armies. The Southerners are freeing the slaves themselves to enlist them in the military. So by the end of 64 in November, this election, most people, at least who are in the know, see that, well, this war is going to end soon and slavery probably with it. So yeah, most seem to see the conclusion coming. Maryland and Missouri actually changed their constitutions. These are two slave states, remember? Maryland, Missouri, and eventually others rewrite their constitutions, permanently ending slavery. So even before the 13th Amendment is passed in 65, we already have multiple slave states rewriting their constitutions to end slavery. So the war is still going, the South has not surrendered, slavery is still legal, and we have multiple slave states rewriting their constitutions, ending slavery. It seems like many people in the South have already realized it's a foregone conclusion. No matter what happens at the end of all this, slavery's over. Many people seem to be accepting it even before the war ends. At least politicians are accepting it. At least politicians seem to be accepting this. Slavery is dying out even before the 13th Amendment is passed. Now, Congress approves it in January. And remember, an amendment has to be voted on by the states. So even if Congress approves something, an amendment, the states have to vote on it to actually ratify it. Congress approves the 13th Amendment, which simply put, ends slavery, any type of forced bondage or something like that, however it's worded. But it's not official until the states vote. But this was approved in January of 65. Slavery's on its way out the door, even before the war, months before the war actually ends. This is Sherman. Boy, he just looks like a bad dude, doesn't he? I mean, he just looks like an asshole, frankly. He's a hero. I mean, Sherman and Grant are heroes. They're the ones that finally get the South to surrender. They're the ones that finally conquer the South. Almost single-handedly. I mean, yes, there's lots of other generals and officers, but these two men had the real drive, the real determination to be willing to do anything. William Tecumseh Sherman, he hated slavery with a passion. It's believed he personally executed 2 slave owners. He summarily executed them, personally with his own pistol, executed them. He hated slave owning. He hated slave owners so much, and he also believed that the slave owners were the reason for all this. That if the slave owners hadn't caused all this, then all this death and suffering wouldn't have happened in the first place. Sometimes he was referred to as a hard war warrior. The Scorched Earth campaign that Grant begins, Sherman takes it and actually expands upon it. We often call this the March to the Sea. It is maybe the single most famous campaign in the American Civil War, Sherman's March to the Sea. He commands the Union Army in Tennessee. He moves south with his army, demolishing everything. He considered civilians combatants. He executed civilians. He executed anyone and everyone and destroyed anything and everything that he believed could be in any way possible contribute to the war effort for the Confederacy. He was known to have burned down entire towns, thousands of structures, executed civilians. Pretty brutal. By modern standards, he's probably a war criminal, truthfully. Grant maybe too. It really shows that what this war came down to. These are the heroes of the war. And by modern standards, they probably would be war criminals for the things they did. That's how bad it got. You had to stoop to this level just to convince the Southerners to give up. And it isn't the Southern regular people. And that's the sad part. Well, it's all sad. The worst part is it's not the regular everyday people. The ones who are suffering under his Scorched Earth campaign, those aren't the people making the laws. Those aren't the people sitting in Richmond. Those are not Jefferson Davis and the politicians in Richmond, the ones that are deciding all this. Those are not the rich, wealthy plantation owners that have retreated or literally left the country. Many of them actually left and got on ships and went to like Barbados and the Caribbean and Europe. They fled the country while leaving their people here fighting and dying the war. They're the ones sitting safely in Richmond behind big barricades and big defenses. They're the ones making the decisions. It's not the regular people doing this, and yet the regular people are the ones that are dying. The soldiers are the ones that are dying, which are mostly common, regular folks. His campaign was terrible. Now, when he did free the blacks, they saw him as a savior. I mean, this life of brutality and violence was common everyday life for a slave. So what Sherman was doing, well, as far as many slaves were concerned, it was justice. It was divine retribution. Sherman coming in and literally killing all the white people that were slave owners and executing them or imprisoning all of them, burning their farms, burning their houses down. For many Southern blacks, this was divine. This is what they had been talking about and praying about for centuries. The divine will of God, literally bringing the hellfire and fury upon the South, all in the form of William Tecumseh Sherman. He even finally gets down to the coast, right around, is it Savannah? Right around Savannah, Georgia. And he issues Special Field Order 15. He gives 500,000 acres to the freedmen. He just takes the land from the slave owners and gives it to the freedmen. Wonderful, great. It seems appropriate. Unfortunately, it was illegal. And all that land is given back to the slave owners afterwards. Even though they're no longer slave owners, it's still white-owned land, and you can't legally take their land from them. During the war, he does. He gives land back to the slaves, which is really even more tragic because many of them start lives, they start farming, they start building houses, and then a couple years later, it all gets taken from them because it wasn't legally given to them. Sherman didn't have the authority to do this. For a while, he certainly seemed great, at least for a while when they were free. Over time, lots of resentment, class resentment, black enlistments. The South is weakened to the point that in essence, there's nothing left to do. I mean, we're now in a war to protect slaves, and yet slavery is pretty much over. everyone understands slavery is ended by 65. It's pretty much just a matter of making it official on paper. What the hell are we fighting for anymore? Many Southerners start to really understand that the rich aren't dying. The rich aren't the ones who are doing this. It's the common people. It's a weird irony. Most of the soldiers who were dying in the Confederacy never owned slaves, never would own slaves. They're common, regular folks, tenant farmers or tenants or laborers or poor farmers. 90% of them would never own a slave, have never owned a slave. What the fuck are they fighting for? What are they doing? Many people, it takes the biggest surprise about this is it takes so long for them to really come to this realization. They're fighting to protect a society that entirely devalues them and exploits them and treats them themselves. Again, I've said before, your common average white person in the South lived about the same socioeconomic life as a slave. They wore similar clothes, they ate similar food, they did similar work. What are they fighting to protect? That's why they had to have all the way back in 62. All the way back in 62, that's why they had to have the draft. Because many Southern whites realized years before this war ended, there was no purpose in this. This war was continued on for the last 2 years by politicians and generals. You take politicians and generals out of the Confederacy, and the South would have surrendered years earlier. Because most Southern whites, frankly, they realized what they were fighting for was nothing they were actually going to gain. They weren't gaining anything from this. At the end of the day, the only thing there was race. It was about white supremacy, really. Finally, Grant surrounds Richmond. Same thing as in Atlanta. General Lee is in Richmond. Lee runs out of Richmond. He retreats from Richmond, leaves Richmond, abandons it. Richmond is captured. The Confederate government's captured. But Lee is still fighting. Lee retreats. Finally, Lee is surrounded around Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. His entire army is surrounded by Grant's army. Grant sends over terms, is what it's called. That's the old gentlemanly way. You send over terms. Basically, he sends over someone waving a white flag to talk to Lee and say, what are we going to do? Let's just end this. Here's our terms. I need unconditional surrender. Your soldiers put down all their weapons, etc., etc. They meet at Appomattox. They have tea and coffee. They sit and chat for a couple hours. They sign some papers. And it's over. Incredibly anticlimactic, if you will. It's almost like a gentlemanly arrangement. A couple of generals sitting, relaxing, having refreshments, signing some documents. And it ends. Lee's surrender. The deadliest, most destructive thing to ever happen to the United States in 400 years, long before we were the U.S. 650,000 dead, 1 million plus casualties, dozens of cities literally gone, dozens of towns and cities literally burned to the ground. Half of Atlanta was destroyed. A third of Richmond was destroyed. Vicksburg was almost burned to the ground. I mean, there's dozens of major cities that were destroyed. Half of New Orleans was blown up. Yeah. Over close to 200,000 people permanently crippled. Remember, they didn't really have modern medicine back then. So if you got injured, they simply cut it off. Your hand, your arm, your foot, your leg, they simply amputated. There were stories about piles of human appendages outside of like schools because they often would take schools and turn them into hospitals. There was stories about piles of human appendages 6 feet high outside of schools. So where literally every single person would come in, all they would do is see what part of his body was injured, and if it was an appendage, which often was, they'd simply cut it off, stitch it up, and move to the next person. Infections were common. They didn't sterilize the tools, so they would use the same tool, operate on one person after another, simply passing disease, infection around. Tens of thousands of people died after the fact of injuries that in modern times would have probably all lived. due to modern medicine. But back then, they simply didn't have it. So if you were injured on a battlefield, good luck. Good luck. Half the people injured died. Of today, things that literally you might get a shot or a pill for. This shows Lee. It shows Sherman's march to the sea. He starts up here from Tennessee, marches. This entire purple area, he destroys everything. He just burns it all the way down here to Savannah. I think Savannah is where he issues that Special Order 15. Then we see the march all the way up here. This is the region where he continues marching up here into North Carolina. Sherman was the scourge of the South. No one could stop him. Then you go up here in the north, and here we actually see Grant surrounding Richmond. Where's Richmond at? Richmond's right here. Grant surrounds Richmond. Lee runs. Lee actually escapes Richmond, flees Richmond down to here. Multiple battles down here, and eventually Lee is surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse, which is actually the name of a town. Many people think it's actually like a courthouse. No, it's actually the name of the community. They surround him here at the little town of Appomattox Courthouse, and he surrenders April 9th. I know over here I have April 8th. Anyway, pick your day. April 8th, April 9th. And he surrenders. Yeah. This is how the war went, sort of. This shows you the color coding of how we slowly defeated the Confederacy. The purple areas were the first to fall. Then the blue areas fell next the following year. Then in 63, the green areas fell to the Union. Then in 64, the orange areas fell. Here you can see Sherman's march down here to Savannah. And then in 65, you can see Sherman going on up here. Sherman kept going here. And then up here, you can see the work of General Grant around Richmond to actually capture. This whole thing here is the attack on Richmond and the capturing of General Lee up here. What I think is also interesting about this map, look at these areas that were never invaded. All these light pink areas were places that were never really attacked or invaded. Regions that were never really touched by the war. However, the areas that were touched, these red and orange areas, were destroyed. Brutally destroyed. Incredible destruction, mayhem, misery, death. No one has an accurate number of how many civilians died as a result of this war. Some historians have said as many as 250,000. That does not figure into that million total. That million total of casualties is like soldiers and people directly involved with the war. But there may have been as many as another 200,000 people that were injured, starved, died of disease, malnutrition, starvation, exposure to the elements because all their homes were burned down in the winter and they froze to death. All of that is really tacked on top of this. This man is alive, by the way. One of the worst aspects of the war, which we haven't ever talked about, is actually the prisoners of war. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured on both sides. This is a prisoner probably from Andersonville. I don't have it in my notes, but Andersonville was a prison in Carolina, I think, to where the Confederacy kept Union soldiers. This was a Union soldier which had been captured and kept in Andersonville prison. At least I think it was Andersonville. This man is alive. Now, I don't know if he lived after this. Who knows if he was still alive after this. But look at this. This isn't a doctored photo. This is what he looked like. I don't know. The Confederacy didn't have food to feed their soldiers the last year or two of the war. They couldn't even feed their soldiers. So if they don't have food for their soldiers, do you think they're going to give food to prisoners? Of course not. So thousands of prisoners were just left to literally starve and rot to death in prisons. Sometimes you see this stuff and you just wonder how humans do this to each other. I don't know. This is a Union prison. This is not bias. the facts are the facts. Confederate prisons were like this. Many of them. They were inhuman. Union prisons weren't. Union prisons actually allowed the soldiers to keep their slaves. Some Confederate soldiers actually went into war. They took the slaves with them to actually carry their supplies, carry their goods, take care of their horses, etc., dig ditches, and do a lot of that menial labor. So many unique Confederate armies actually had slaves with them, doing much of the manual menial labor stuff. This Confederate soldier was actually allowed to keep his slave with him. Because remember, the slaves are considered property. Until the 13th Amendment, that's actually his property. He was allowed to keep it, even while he was a prisoner. I'm not saying every prisoner got to do this, but the reality is prisoners were treated 100 times better in Union prison camps than Union soldiers were treated in Confederate prison camps. Just the way it is. The Union had lots of supplies. By the end of the war, the Union actually had a bigger economy, more food, more supplies, more soldiers, and was actually making more money, had a bigger economy in GDP than when the war began. While the Confederacy continued to shrink and be destroyed, the Union actually grew and expanded. We added a couple of new states. I mean, life in the rest of the U.S. just kept on moving along. Yeah. That's General Custer right there, which Captain Custer here, if you the very famous Little Bighorn last stand. We won't talk about it in this class. We would talk about it in the next class, the terrible things that Custer does. Well, that ends it. That ends this chapter. Thanks for going with me. I know it was long, but it's also one of the most significant periods in American history. So it's good that we spent some time talking about it. Take care.